Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Before I begin, I want to thank Wendy Wick-Reeves for organizing the book and just for your leadership in this symposium. And I would be remiss not to recognize Jackie Petito, who is really the architect of this symposium. And if it goes smoothly, and I think it is so far, it's really a thank you to Jackie. So thank you, Jackie. In March 1863, a man commonly known as Gordon escaped enslavement and fled to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he purportedly enlisted in the Union Army. There, Gordon would have joined nearly 200,000 other African American soldiers in the fight against the Confederacy. Like all soldiers, Gordon had to undergo a medical examination, and the doctors discovered severe scarring on his back, clear evidence of wounds inflicted by a whip. At this point, the Baton Rouge-based photography team of McPherson and Oliver made multiple portraits of him from 2 different sittings. While the early history of these photographs remains somewhat opaque, this image recorded very clearly the terrible abuse that Gordon survived. The presentation of visual trauma was thought to be an effective tool for transatlantic abolitionism, which had long used images and illustrations in its argument against slavery. The original photograph of Gordon, therefore, was copied and mass-produced in the form of carte de visite by commercial studios like that of Matthew Brady. The Brady reproduction features the most arresting image of Gordon. And here I have pictured 2 different images, but I'm really describing the one on the right, but I have the other one pictured just for comparison. Like the other, he sits shirtless with his left hand placed just above his belted trousers. He looks to his left, turning his head but not gazing over his shoulder. His eyes remain open, and his lips meet to create a firm, closed position. His hair is closely cropped, but its coarse texture creates a slight bump just above his forehead. His goatee, with its light streaks of gray, appears to graze his shoulder. However, and importantly, Gordon holds his left arm at an angle and uses his hand to gesture towards his back. He angles his elbow upward and outward, achieving his pose through a self-conscious effort. The placement of his arm flexes the sinews straight up through his shoulder, creating enough tension to make it physically uncomfortable for him. The inner arm's musculature creates a dark, shadowy line, and the outline muscle demonstrates a fit, active body. His left hand turns vigorously upward and outward, providing an ample view of his palm. The left arm takes up almost half of the picture's area, whereas the exposed back, distinguished by an abstraction of crisscrossing keloid scars marking the skin, takes up the remainder of the picture plane. Gordon's purposeful display of musculature exhibits a meaningful capacity for discomfort. As he reaches his hand back, almost gesturing towards his scars, he activates his body, which, while aged, appears very strong. "Here is what I have endured," he seems to say. The implication is subtle, but together, the combination of his self-aware posture and his demonstration of strength suggests Gordon's willingness to tolerate the pain again, and perhaps even more, for his freedom. The visual culture of the carte de visite turns into an activist action with this image, as it insists unapologetically on presenting the brutality of slavery. The iconic image was then made into a woodcut that was reproduced in the July 4, 1863 issue of Harper's Weekly. This circular proceeded to reach an extraordinarily wide audience of about 200,000 subscribers. Spurred by this record of inhumane treatment, which, were it made today, we might label as activist art, Many free blacks enlisted in the Union Army. This was particularly the case because the Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, allowed black men to fight as combat soldiers in the Union Army rather than limiting their service to manual labor. In these contexts, the portrait of Gordon, featuring his back, became a linchpin not only in the abolitionist cause, but also in the recruiting effort of the Union Army. For all that we do not know about Gordon, what little we do know places him in Baton Rouge and in contact with the photographers McPherson and Oliver. So if we hold that information to be true, then Gordon may well have been near or even part of a siege of Port Hudson. McPherson and Oliver photographed Port Hudson, which is approximately 25 miles north of Baton Rouge, in 1863, after the siege. Lasting 48 days, this was the final engagement in the Union campaign to recapture the Mississippi River during the American Civil War. The defenses of Port Hudson were well prepared, and some 6,500 Confederates held off about 30,000 Union soldiers. Although not all scholars agree, some believe that Gordon was a part of the assaulting forces because General Nathaniel P. Banks was in charge of the assault. And okay, he was a terrible military strategist, but he did make history by raising an all-black unit for the Union Army, the Corps d'Afrique. Across the South, this is what intrigued me. What happens when you arm black men? Across the South, the arming of black men triggered great fear among whites. And I honestly think the Second Amendment debates that we have today really stem from this fear. In the post-war period, Louisiana in particular was a hotbed of racism. Louisiana was only one of 3 states where slaves outnumbered whites in the census of 1860. Given the height of the tension in Louisiana, the federal army occupied it longer than any other state until 1877. These contexts illustrate how violence most likely informed any expectation Gordon had about post-war life. Gordon's display of his pre-war scars may even reflect a shrewd assessment of what would come in the future. The life of a free black man might not have been any less violent than that of someone who was enslaved. And Gordon was no fool. He knew how bad it could be, life could be, and he had the scars to prove it. Arming black men, in effect, created the ultimate weapon against the Confederate South, and in the Reconstruction era, against the Democratic Party. Indeed, when black men had learned how to assert their authority and had developed the skills of soldiering, they endangered white supremacy. The 1873 Colfax Massacre was the culminating event of more than a decade of severe racial tension in Louisiana. In hindsight, it is clear that the hotly contested Louisiana governor's race of 1872 preempted this massacre. Although Republicans narrowly won this contest, Democrats were very angry over the defeat, and then they turned to violence. Colfax Parish, in this parish, a white paramilitary force directly challenged a mostly black state militia who were defending the Colfax courthouse, found themselves defending this courthouse after they were challenged. More than 300 armed white men, including members of white supremacist organizations such as the Knights of the White Camilla and the Ku Klux Klan, attacked the courthouse building. When the white groups maneuvered a cannon to fire on the courthouse, some of the 60 black defenders fled while others surrendered. And at this point, normal protocol of conflict is that if you surrender, your life should be saved. But this protocol was ignored. Black defenders who were wounded in the earlier battle were then singled out for execution, while other African Americans who had not been at the courthouse were then victims of indiscriminate killing. Historians are not sure exactly how many black Americans were killed and what could only have been savage butchery. but estimates immediately after the event fell between 64 and 400. So that's helpful. Only 3 whites were killed, and the few who were injured in the very few were injured in this largely one-sided Battle of Colfax. After order was reestablished, approximately 97 white men were arrested and are charged with violation of the U.S. Enforcement Act of 1870, which was basically prohibited people to band together and terrorize others. It was also called the Ku Klux Klan Act. Although a few were convicted, they were released in 1875 when the U.S. Supreme Court in United States versus Cruikshank and ruled that the Enforcement Act was unconstitutional. From the way in which the massacre has been memorialized, and you see on the left a memorial from 1950, and on the right a memorial from 1920, you can see who. It's a selective memory. Collective memory, in this case, is a selective memory. The case of Colfax demonstrates the drastic failure of Reconstruction as initiated by the federal government. Although entirely too complicated to boil down to one narrative, the failed project is in part due to what I was mentioning before, that outcome of 1875's United States versus Cruikshank. It was, maybe one way to summarize it is as follows. Because state governments and not the federal government had jurisdiction over crimes committed by private individuals, they were able to undermine federal power in the prosecution of racial terrorism. As the Colfax massacre demonstrates, then, white supremacist violence spread in the form of paramilitary action, becoming increasingly overt in the disobedience of federal law. What began as vigilante terrorism grew into organized militia known as the White League. This white supremacist militia was determined to use force to oust Republicans from power and end the Army's constabulary role of surveillance over state elections. Here we see Thomas Nast's illustration for Harper's Weekly, picturing a man representing the White League shaking hands with a Ku Klux Klan member over a shield illustrated with terrorized African-American couple and their baby. The baby has a limp arm, which indicates it might be dead. The eagle of the United States seems to be swallowed by the flames of the deadly contract enacted by both sides. This image very clearly animates how dangerous it was for African Americans. It's captioned the Union as it was. This is a white man's government, worse than slavery. Although during the early 1870s, all the Republican state governments across the South showed dangerous signs of strain, Louisiana was the most precarious. Because recognition of the commercial possibilities of portrait photography coincided with the outbreak of the American Civil War, the carte de visite had an immense influence on how individuals thought about having their picture taken and with whom they chose to share those images. Oliver Wendell Holmes acknowledged that the popular new card portraits had become, quote, the social currency, the sentimental greenbacks of civilization. So I'm wondering, did Gordon know of the portable portrait and its power as he sat for the creation of his own likeness in the carte de visite? Even if he was shown the format just prior to sitting across from the camera, he would have had what W.E.B. Du Bois later described as a double consciousness, or, quote, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Gordon almost casts a glance back over his shoulder. His demonstration of his profile and the cocking of his elbow radiate an acute sense of self-awareness or a double consciousness. Perhaps his pose can even be treated as self-expression. Gordon in this photograph seems to want to convince viewers that he is ready for his future, whatever it holds. Portraits in that they innately recognize humanity, often offer particularly influential tools for unlocking perceived differences among social groups. Moreover, studying portraits, such as that of Gordon, in their original context as well as in relation to the contemporary moment, helps to reveal the power of the art object in collective memory and in healing from trauma. Black contemporary artists have turned to the image of Gordon as a necessary and crucial component of work that addresses African American identity today. In her series, From Here, I Saw What Happened and I Cried of 1995, Carrie Mae Weems appropriates photographic representations of 19th century Americans, and then, in this case, she etches into glass texts that lament the physical and symbolic violence to the Black body and places those sheets of glass over the historic imagery. In this example, she chose to use the photograph of Gordon's back in her work Black and Tanned. Working from the original era's carte de visite, Weems placed a replica or a copy of the image on blood red background and framed it with a round waffle-textured mat. She modified the image of Gordon by cropping it with the mat and creates a kind of zoom-like focus. Sandblasted into the glass, placed on top of the image, are the words, "Black and tanned, your whipped wind of change howled low, blowing itself, smack, into the middle of Ellington's orchestra. Billy heard it too, and cried strange fruit tears." In effect, Weems layers a Black experience of the 19th century under one of the 20th. The placement of the blurred image of Gordon under the crisp letters referencing 20th century Black culture, including the music of Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday, both of which reference lynching violence, all work together to configure a visual intersection of two different times. In blocking from view what we know now so well, Gordon's hand gesture, Weems forces us to look again at his image in other ways. In the history of photography, documentary photography has been used to create pseudoscientific racial classifications, which Weems explicitly addresses in her series. By appropriating the Gordon image, the artist calls critical attention to the ways in which the camera was implicated in the dehumanization of Black people. The scholar Cassandra Jackson notes how, quote, "the place of the photographer, the viewer, and that of the abuser are all one in the same, an illusion that compounds the tension between past and present while clarifying the way in which the photograph extends beyond such boundaries," end quote. In Weems' own words, the exploration of trauma and violence endured by Black Americans helped her, quote, "rise above the depiction of Blacks always as a victim of the gaze," end quote. 10 years after Weems appropriated the image of Gordon, artist Hank Willis Thomas made his Branded series, which looks at how Black male bodies are represented in contemporary advertising. His work, The Chase MasterCard, features an inverted or flipped image of Gordon so that he is pictured looking to his right. The image is severely cropped, showing only his nose, his upper arm, and half his back, and it serves as the background for a fictionalized Chase Bank credit card. On the left, drawings of various types of slave shackles, strongly reminiscent of images used in abolitionist broadsides, form a visual ladder from top to bottom or vice versa. Within the box of the MasterCard logo is another drawing of the schema of a slave ship with its diagram of tight packing, or what slavers did to fill their ships to capacity with suffering human cargo. The date 1619 is presented in the member sense space, alluding to the year the first slave ship arrived in Jamestown. The Chase logo tops the tagline, "The right relationship is everything." By appropriating the image of Gordon and placing it within the context of a credit card, an object that millions use every day to pay for consumer goods, Thomas forces viewers to recognize the back of the slave as the base of American economy and to question their own part in a dishonest economic system. As time passes, the affective distancing from trauma allows people to better analyze the context in which the violence happened. More than 150 years after the making of the photographs of Gordon, the legacy of the burden of the scourged back manifests itself in art like that by Thomas and Weems. They and other activists continue to confront a past through a sense of modern vulnerability. Through their work, Thomas and Weems intertwine Gordon's scars with echoes of gunshots and murders in the present. Black men in the United States suffer more murders by police than any other racial group, and witnesses of their murders have recorded and communicated these horrific events to a much broader audience through social media. Black Americans have been at the center of a long struggle for citizenship rights, as we well know today. Gordon's subversive pose has many consequences on the act of remembering. Appropriation of the past, such as what Thomas and Weems have done with the image of Gordon, and therefore of the subversive acts of enslaved people, demonstrates how Black Americans today are still processing and producing an identity. The very act of remembering violence on the Black body implicates the value of citizenship. Meanwhile, the double consciousness from the turn of the century cannot be described as changed, but rather as evolved and adapted. In contemporary contexts, Black Americans take on a more ruthless edge in their collective memory in what could only be called a collective reckoning. The appropriation of Gordon's scourged back is a ruthless confrontation with the realities of the past. Although individual memory of slavery has almost completely died out, there remains a powerful communication of trauma inherent in gazing on the scourged back. The image of the scars of slavery, originally made into a souvenir, a keepsake, or a forget-me-not, remains an intermediary between the past and the present, ever cautioning the future through the burdened legacy of memory. What I would like to ask my colleagues and the audience gathered today is to consider the difference between memory and reckoning and the role that historic identity might have in this. Using the example of Gordon as our case study, can you also identify other examples that might similarly engage contemporary activism by using a historic lens? Thank you so much.